The courtroom was silent, an oppressive weight hanging in the air as Peter Graham sat in the defendant's chair. The cold, sterile walls of the courtroom seemed to close in on him as he fought to suppress the despair that had taken root in his chest over the years. The silence was suffocating, thick and unnatural, like a heavy blanket, smothering any sense of hope or clarity. Peter had always thought that the worst of it, the fiery inferno that had taken his livelihood and his freedom, was behind him. But sitting here today, chained and humiliated, he realized that the fire had never really gone out. It had merely shifted into something far more insidious, a slow burn that had consumed his soul instead of his body. He was a man wrongfully convicted, a 38-year-old former engineer whose life had been shattered by a fire he didn't start. The once promising future that lay ahead of him had evaporated in a cloud of smoke, leaving only the bitter ashes of a life he could never get back. Peter had once stood on the precipice of success, his future as solid as the steel beams he designed. He had dreams, ambitions, plans to make a mark in the world. But one mistake, one misstep, had turned everything upside down. Now, he faced a death sentence for a crime he didn't commit. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, Peter's mind wandered back to the fire, the one that had taken everything from him. He could still remember the crackling sounds, the towering flames that had swallowed the old warehouse, the thick, black smoke that had billowed into the sky, casting an eerie glow over the city. The images played over and over in his mind, a broken record of anguish and despair. Yet no matter how often he replayed it, he couldn't understand how this had become his fate. He hadn't started the fire. He hadn't even been near the scene when it began. But none of that had mattered. The truth had been buried beneath a pile of circumstantial evidence, twisted by the very system that was supposed to protect him. Peter's family had tried everything to get him exonerated. His mother, a frail woman with silver hair and tear-streaked cheeks, had written letter after letter to anyone who would listen. She had begged for justice, pleaded for someone to look into the case, to see her son as more than just a name in a folder. She had hired private investigators who dug deep into the circumstances surrounding the fire, only to find themselves stifled at every turn. They had contacted every lawyer in the state, desperate for someone to take his case, but no one listened. They were told the same thing every time: it's a lost cause. The evidence is against him. The more they fought, the more they were silenced. It was as if the entire world had turned its back on Peter, leaving him stranded in a sea of injustice, unable to breathe, to escape. His family had believed in him. They had believed that the truth would eventually come to light. But even they were beginning to lose hope. His mother's letters grew less frequent, her eyes duller with each passing visit. His father had stopped coming altogether, consumed by the shame and helplessness of it all. The evidence was stacked against him, and the court had already made its decision. No one seemed to care about the truth. No one seemed to want to hear his side of the story. The flames had taken more than just his career and his freedom. They had taken his sense of self, his faith in the very system that was supposed to uphold justice. And as he sat there, waiting for the judge to pass her final judgment, Peter couldn't help but wonder, what was it all for? What had he done to deserve this? What could he have done differently? His heart pounded in his chest as the judge stood, raising her gavel. The rhythm of her movement, so deliberate, so calculated, made his stomach twist. The finality of the moment was suffocating, the last breath of air before a storm hit. Peter's hands, shackled to the chair, trembled. His body had become a stranger to him, stiff and aching. It had been so long since he had felt free, so long since he had felt anything but the constant pressure of the walls closing in. He didn't know how much longer he could hold on to his sanity, how much longer he could endure the weight of a life that wasn't his. He thought of Max, the golden retriever who had saved him from despair time and time again. Max had always been there for him, a constant companion in the most trying times of his life. When the world had turned its back on Peter, when the walls of his prison cell had seemed to close in around him, it had been Max who had kept him going. Max's calming presence, his steady gaze, the way the dog would curl up next to him in the cold of the night, these were the things that had kept Peter from completely losing himself. Max had no idea how much he had saved Peter's soul. Max wasn't here, but Peter could feel the dog's calming presence. A part of him believed that Max had been the one keeping him alive in these dark times. There were nights when Peter would lie awake in his cell, his thoughts spiraling into darkness, only for Max's spirit to fill the space around him. The warmth of his fur, the softness of his eyes. It was as though Max were there, lying next to him, reassuring him that he was not alone. Peter closed his eyes now, trying to steady his breathing. He couldn't escape the suffocating reality of the situation, but for a moment, he allowed himself to drift into the memory of Max's love. In a world where everything else had failed him, Max had been his anchor, the only thing he could rely on. Max had been his friend, his confidant, his savior. When the world had seemed too dark to navigate, Max had been the light. With the weight of impending doom pressing down on him, Peter closed his eyes and clung to the only thing that had given him solace, his dog's love. Even now, in the deepest darkness of his life, Max was there. And somehow, that was enough. Max had never been allowed in the courtroom before, but Peter's thoughts were flooded with images of the dog, the golden fur, the intelligent eyes, and the steady presence that had become his lifeline. Max had always been more than a dog to Peter. He was more than just a loyal companion. He was the tangible embodiment of hope in a world that had stripped Peter of everything, his career, his freedom, his dignity. In the deep sorrow of his years behind bars, it had been Max who kept him grounded, reminding him of the world beyond the steel bars, beyond the suffocating walls of his prison cell. Max, with his soft, yet powerful presence, was the one constant in Peter's life. When the world had been cruel, when it seemed like nothing else could be trusted, Max had been there. Always there, with his calm demeanor and undying loyalty. The bond they shared had been formed through shared pain and understanding. Max had been adopted from a shelter, his past a patchwork of neglect, abandonment, and uncertainty, much like Peter's own life. Both of them had been discarded by those who should have cared for them, abandoned by those who should have given them a chance. Max had been left in that cold, heartless shelter, his only crime being that he had been too much of a burden for someone who had never understood his worth. Peter had been left by the system, his life a casualty of broken promises and a failure to listen to the truth. Max, like Peter, had been thrown into a world of uncertainty and cruelty, yet somehow, they had found each other. Neither of them had asked for this fate. Neither of them had chosen the hardships they faced, but life had thrown them together, and together, they had fought through it all. Max had become Peter's anchor in this storm, the one thing in his life that remained steadfast. It was as though Max had understood Peter's pain from the moment they met. There was an unspoken language between them, a deep connection that needed no words. Max sensed the weight of Peter's sorrow, the depth of his struggle, and Peter knew that Max understood, even when no one else did. The bond they shared was profound, built on mutual need, trust, and unspoken understanding. Max had never judged Peter. He had never questioned him. No matter how deep Peter's despair grew, Max's golden eyes had always been filled with nothing but acceptance. Max had seen Peter in his lowest moments, had shared in his solitude, yet had never faltered in his devotion. Even when Peter could not find the strength to go on, Max was there, silent, steady, and unwavering. Max had been Peter's rock, his saving grace, his reason to keep breathing on days when it felt like the world was nothing but an abyss. And now, as Peter sat in that cold courtroom, waiting for the judge to deliver her verdict, he felt that bond more than ever. Max's presence was like a silent echo in the back of Peter's mind. It was as though the dog was still beside him, curled up on the floor, resting his head against Peter's leg, the warmth of his fur providing comfort amidst the coldness that surrounded him. Even though Max was not physically present, Peter could feel his dog's energy, his soul, a calming force that seemed to cut through the weight of impending doom. In the prison cell, Max lay peacefully on his bed, unaware of what was unfolding in the courtroom. Or so Peter thought. Max, the ever-dedicated dog, would have been fast asleep, dreaming of running through fields, chasing after the tennis balls that Peter would throw for him during their rare moments of freedom. But Peter knew better than to assume that Max was simply sleeping. He had seen the dog's alertness, the way his ears perked up at the slightest sound, the way he could sense something before anyone else could. Max was not just a dog, he was a silent observer of the world around him, always vigilant, always attuned to the energy that flowed through the room. Peter had often wondered if Max, in his own way, understood the injustice Peter was enduring. If Max could feel the weight of the wrongful conviction, if he could somehow sense the truth buried beneath the layers of lies. Then, in the midst of Peter's anxious thoughts, something stirred within him. His chest tightened, his heart skipped a beat, and he was overcome with a sudden rush of urgency. It was as though a switch had been flipped in his mind. And then, like a sudden bolt of lightning, a loud, frantic bark echoed through the silence in Peter's mind. Max! The bark wasn't just a random noise, it was sharp, it was urgent, and it pierced through the clouded haze of Peter's thoughts like a siren in the distance. Peter's heart leapt in his chest. The sound was so real, so vivid, that he could almost feel Max's breath on his face. The sensation was so powerful that for a brief moment, Peter wondered if Max was right there beside him in the courtroom, his golden fur glowing in the harsh fluorescent light, his eyes locked onto Peter with that same unshakable devotion. The bark rang louder in Peter's ears, a call that seemed to demand his attention. It felt like a warning, a cry for help. Max was trying to tell him something important. Peter's mind raced as the urgency of the sound reverberated in his chest. Was Max in danger? Was something happening to him in the prison? But as the moment stretched on, Peter's heart slowed, and the pieces began to fall into place. The bark wasn't a warning about physical danger, it was something far more profound. It was a signal. Max, in his own way, was trying to communicate with Peter, trying to guide him toward the truth that had eluded him for so long. In that instant, Peter understood. Max, his loyal companion, was not just a dog, he was Peter's guide, his silent witness to the truth. Max had always been there, standing by Peter's side when no one else would. And now, even though they were separated by walls of concrete and metal, Max's presence was as powerful as ever. He was still fighting for Peter, still barking in the face of injustice, still trying to uncover the truth that had been buried under layers of lies. The weight in Peter's chest lightened ever so slightly, and he straightened in his chair. The dog's spirit had never left him. Max had been with him all along, quiet, steady, unwavering. And now, Peter knew, more than ever, that the truth would come to light. Max's call had awakened something within him, a surge of strength, a deep sense of purpose. He wasn't alone. Max was with him, guiding him through the storm, and together, they would find a way to expose the lies and set the world right again. In the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The air itself seemed to thicken, suffused with a stillness that reverberated like the calm before a storm. Every breath Peter took felt like it could be his last before the gavel fell, final, unyielding, condemning. His body, stiff with dread, was locked in place as if it too had been branded by the weight of the injustice. His chest rose and fell in shallow gasps, each one a slow attempt at maintaining composure. The crowd surrounding him seemed to blur, every face frozen, every glance a silent reminder of his entrapment. Even the hum of the courtroom lights, the shuffle of papers, the cough of a spectator, it all seemed muted, as if the world were holding its breath for the inevitable verdict. At the front of the room, Charles Holt, the prosecutor, stood with his hands resting on the podium, poised to announce the sentence. The flicker of triumph danced in his eyes, though it was masked by the professionalism of his posture. He was the one who had ensured that Peter's conviction stuck. He was the one who had built the case against Peter with painstaking effort and determination. His victory was in reach, and Peter could see it, the way his jaw clenched, the subtle tightening of his shoulders. The prosecutor was ready to speak, to seal Peter's fate. But just as Holt opened his mouth to deliver the final blow, a strange, disorienting commotion erupted from the back of the room. The tension snapped like a taut wire. The bailiff's frantic voice cut through the air. "There's something in the judge's desk," he shouted. The room froze in an instant, like a single note on a piano held too long. Peter's pulse quickened. His eyes flickered with panic, his mind racing, trying to understand what had happened. This wasn't supposed to be part of the script. No one was prepared for this. What had Max tried to warn him about? What did this mean? The gavel that had hovered above the judge's desk now seemed to hang in space, suspended, forgotten. It was as though time itself had come to a screeching halt. The courtroom, once alive with murmurs, was now plunged into complete, nerve-wracking silence. The audience, a sea of faces that had once been so focused on Peter's trial, shifted nervously in their seats, their confusion palpable. Peter's heart hammered in his chest as he fought to make sense of the unfolding events. His mind, desperate for clarity, reached out for any tether of logic in the chaos. What had just happened? He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, hoping the silence would hold just long enough for him to find his bearings. Could this be real? Could this be the moment I've been waiting for? The bailiff, his voice shaky with unease, was still fumbling at the judge's desk. "Sir," he stammered, finally pulling out an old photograph, its edges worn and curling with age. "I found this, in the judge's desk." Peter's breath caught in his throat. The photograph, yellowed with time, felt like a bomb waiting to explode in his hands. He could feel his stomach twist as the room remained deathly quiet. The judge's desk, usually a place of order, of structure, was now the center of a storm that had come out of nowhere. Peter's eyes locked onto the photo. The image was faded, as though it had been buried, hidden for years, but it was clear enough for Peter to see. It showed a man, his back to the camera, walking away from a burning building. The inferno was still raging in the background, the flames licking the sky with an unholy hunger. The heat of the fire seemed to leap off the photograph itself, almost tangible. It was a scene Peter had seen far too many times in his mind's eye, a fire, destruction, chaos. But this was different. This photograph, this moment, wasn't just an image of something that had already happened. This was proof. Peter's chest tightened, his body went cold, the blood draining from his face as his mind spun. That man. His breath caught in his throat. That man. He was there. He was the one who did this to me. The photo was like a door opening to a reality that had been locked away for years. The way the man moved, the way he carried himself, it was familiar. Too familiar. Peter's heart pounded with recognition. Every fiber of his being screamed that this was the man who had framed him. The man who set the fire. This was the truth Peter had been searching for all along, the missing piece of the puzzle that had eluded him for so long. "That's him," Peter whispered, barely audible, but enough for those around him to hear. His voice trembled with the weight of the revelation, the long-suppressed truth coming to the surface at last. "That's the man who did it." The room seemed to collectively hold its breath. Even the prosecutor, Charles Holt, had stopped speaking. He looked up in shock, his expression one of complete confusion. His usual composure faltered as his eyes darted from Peter to the photograph, then back again. His mouth opened slightly, as if he were searching for something to say, but the words seemed to have left him. Peter's voice wavered, thick with the adrenaline and disbelief that surged through him. "That's him. I swear it. That's the man who set the fire." Holt's face shifted, his brow furrowing in confusion, his steely facade cracking for the first time in years. What was happening? He seemed to wonder. Peter, on the other hand, was filled with a different kind of certainty. His mind, usually clouded by the fog of despair and helplessness, had cleared in that moment. For the first time in years, Peter could see the truth with perfect clarity. It was undeniable. The image in front of him wasn't just a photograph, it was the final testament to his innocence. It was the key that would finally unlock the chains that had bound him for far too long. The courtroom remained eerily silent, the air thick with the weight of the discovery. The judge, looking shaken, stared at the photograph, her hands trembling slightly as she glanced from the photo to the prosecutor. The truth had just cracked open, and there was no turning back now. In that moment, Peter knew something had changed. The gavel that had seemed so inevitable just moments ago was now irrelevant. The wheels of justice had been set in motion, and this photograph, this forgotten relic, was the catalyst. The truth was no longer a whisper in the dark. It was a shout, loud and clear, and no one could ignore it. Not anymore. For the first time, Peter allowed himself to hope. Max's presence, although not physically in the courtroom, was more powerful than ever. The moment the photograph had been revealed, it was as though Max's very spirit had filled the space, a presence that Peter could feel deep in his bones. The bark that had echoed in Peter's mind just moments before, sharp and urgent, now felt like the key to unlocking a mystery that had haunted him for years, a riddle he'd never been able to solve, one that had twisted around him like the smoke from the fire itself. Every unanswered question, every sleepless night, every moment of helplessness, all of it seemed to lead to this singular moment of truth. The image of the man in the photograph haunted Peter's thoughts. Even though the man's face was obscured, there was something undeniably familiar about him. Peter recognized the posture, the way the man carried himself. It was the same man who had framed him, the same man whose actions had taken everything from him. But there was more. There was always more. The pieces were falling into place too quickly for Peter to keep up, each one heavier than the last, each one slamming into his chest with the weight of a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to bear. The twist hit Peter like a blow to the chest. The photograph, a relic of the past, was not just a random image. It was a haunting connection, a tether between his painful present and a past he had never known. The man in the photograph, the one walking away from the fire, was no stranger. Peter had never seen him before, but his body, his movement, there was something about the way he stood that made Peter's heart race. The familiarity was overwhelming. And then the realization hit him like a freight train, nearly knocking the breath out of him. The man in the photograph had once been Max's owner. Max, his loyal, loving dog, the one who had stuck by him through every sleepless night and every moment of darkness, had once belonged to the very man who had set the fire. Max had been trained by him, bound to him, before Peter ever even knew the truth about the fire or the man behind it. The thought was staggering, nearly too much to comprehend. Peter's mind struggled to piece it together. The idea that Max, his dog, his protector, had been a part of the arsonist's life before Peter had taken him in was an almost unbearable concept. How could it be? How could Max, the very same dog that had been his salvation, have once been a silent companion to someone so malicious, so intent on destroying Peter's life? Max had been a part of the criminal's life, a quiet witness to the fire, a silent observer of the chaos that had destroyed everything Peter had worked for. Peter's hands clenched into fists as the implications of this new information swirled in his head. Max had been there that night, standing by, watching the flames rage, knowing something was wrong, but powerless to stop it. And yet, when Max had been abandoned, when the man had no longer found use for him, Max had found his way to Peter. Against all odds, Max had wandered through the darkness, leaving behind the shadow of the man who had once trained him, and into the light of Peter's life. Peter had never understood why Max had come to him so unconditionally. Now, it seemed as though fate had worked in mysterious ways. Max had known all along. Max had been trying to tell him the truth, even though Peter didn't understand. The dog had been silent, watching, listening, and waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. But all those times Peter had looked into Max's intelligent eyes, unsure of the dog's silent, unspoken gaze, he had missed the message. Max had been trying to show him something that, until now, Peter could never have imagined. It was as if the dog had always known the truth, even though Peter had been blind to it. Max's bond with Peter had been the only thing strong enough to carry them both through the darkness, to keep them both alive when the world seemed intent on crushing them. Max had been a constant, a reminder that no matter how deeply the night seemed to stretch, there would always be light on the horizon. But now, that light was flickering, the truth that had been kept from Peter for so long finally burning its way to the surface. The courtroom was a blur as Peter's thoughts raced. It felt as though the walls were closing in around him, the weight of the discovery pressing down on his chest. He struggled to breathe, the truth suffocating him, the realization that everything he had known about his dog was shifting beneath his feet. How could he have been so blind? How could he not have seen the connection? Max had known, he had known the truth long before Peter did. All those nights spent in his cell, all those moments when Peter had felt as if he were falling into an abyss of despair, Max had been there, not just as a companion, but as a silent partner in the quest for the truth. Peter closed his eyes, his mind whirling with images of Max, the dog who had saved him time and time again. Max had never judged him. Max had never questioned him. Max had always just been there, with a steady presence and unwavering loyalty. Now, Peter realized that Max had been much more than that. Max was more than just a dog. He was a keeper of secrets, a silent witness to the past that had shaped Peter's future. And in this moment, Peter knew, Max had been the key all along. The truth was out there. And it was Max, the dog who had once been abandoned, the dog who had once been part of the very life Peter had fought against, who had led him to it. It was Max's silent dedication, his unspoken loyalty, that had set Peter on the path to redemption. And for the first time in years, Peter knew with absolute certainty that the battle wasn't over yet. They were about to expose the lies. And together, Peter and Max would face the truth that had been hiding in the shadows, waiting to be revealed. The courtroom was in chaos. It felt as though a violent storm had ripped through the room, scattering the carefully constructed order into a whirlwind of confusion. People were speaking over each other, voices raised in frantic debates, trying to make sense of the photograph and its implication. It was no longer just a courtroom. It had transformed into a battleground where the very essence of truth was being questioned and reshaped. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor, the frantic rustle of papers, the low hum of urgent whispers, each noise only added to the growing disarray. The judge, her face a portrait of stern authority, slammed her gavel down with a force that could have split the room in half. "Order in the court," she commanded, but her words were swallowed by the tumult. It was clear that no one knew how to proceed. The rules of the game had changed, and no one was prepared for this new reality. Charles Holt, the prosecutor, stood at the front of the room, his usual confident demeanor shattered. His face, once stone-cold and unflinching, was now a mask of confusion and frustration. His hands, which had once rested comfortably on the podium, now fumbled with the papers before him, the edges of his suit jacket creasing as if he were trying to hold himself together. His composure, which had been so meticulously crafted over the course of the trial, was slipping away like sand through his fingers. The truth had come crashing into the courtroom like an unstoppable force, and it was clear Holt didn't know how to stop it. Peter stood, his legs trembling beneath him, but his voice rang out loud and clear. "This man, he set the fire. And Max, my dog, has been the only one who knew it." His words were not just an accusation, they were a declaration. In that moment, Peter wasn't just a man fighting for his life. He was a man who had lived in the shadows for far too long, and now, finally, the light was breaking through. His voice, though shaky, carried the weight of years of wrongful conviction, of suffering, of unanswered questions. It was the truth he had been longing to speak, and now that it had left his lips, it felt like a relief, a burden lifted. The air in the courtroom seemed to shift as Peter's words reverberated against the walls. Max's bark echoed in Peter's mind once more, sharp and urgent, as if the dog was finally being heard, his message loud and clear. Peter could feel Max's presence in that moment, more real than ever, even though the dog wasn't physically by his side. It was as though Max had been waiting for this, waiting for Peter to speak, to finally bring the truth to light. The bark, the one that had echoed through Peter's thoughts in the past, now felt like a triumphant shout, a battle cry for justice that had been held back for far too long. The judge, her face pale with the weight of the discovery, ordered the photograph to be investigated immediately. The room fell silent as the implications of Peter's words began to sink in. This was no longer just about a fire. It was about everything. Everything that had been hidden, everything that had been twisted, everything that had been buried beneath lies. The photograph wasn't just a random piece of evidence, it was a key that would unlock the truth Peter had been denied for so long. As the investigation into the photograph began, it didn't take long for the truth to surface. The man in the picture, the one Peter had recognized so immediately, was not a stranger after all. His identity was uncovered with terrifying ease. The man had a criminal record, one that tied him directly to the fire that had destroyed Peter's life. The connections were undeniable. It was clear now that the case against Peter had been built on lies, on falsehoods and half-truths carefully constructed to create a narrative that suited the agenda of those who had worked so hard to convict him. Peter's heart raced as the details unfolded before him. The case that had once seemed so clear, so indisputable, had been built on manipulated evidence, evidence that had been twisted, hidden, and fabricated to point the blame in his direction. His conviction had never been about finding the truth, it had been about protecting someone else. The more Peter learned, the more the room seemed to close in around him. But at the same time, the truth, this long-buried truth, felt like air filling his lungs after years of suffocation. It was almost too much to bear. And then, amidst the flood of revelations, one undeniable fact emerged. Max, his loyal dog, had been the key to exposing it all. The dog who had never once questioned Peter's innocence, the dog who had simply been there, day after day, standing by his side without fail. Max had been the silent witness to everything. It was Max's instincts, his connection to Peter, that had uncovered the truth. The photograph, the final piece of the puzzle, had been there all along, waiting to be discovered. But without Max's bark, without the dog's unwavering presence in Peter's life, the truth would have remained buried forever. Peter felt a surge of gratitude so fierce, so overwhelming, that it nearly brought him to his knees. Max had not just been his companion, he had been his savior. In a world that had shown him only cruelty and indifference, Max had been the one constant, the one who had never wavered, never abandoned him. And now, that bond, that deep, unspoken trust, had led them to this moment, a moment where the truth would finally be heard. As the judge's voice cut through the murmurs of disbelief in the courtroom, Peter's mind swirled with the enormity of what was happening. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had suffered injustice, for everyone who had ever felt the crushing weight of a system that had failed them. And as the reality of it all settled in, Peter realized one undeniable truth: Max had been the true hero all along. As the truth began to unfold, the courtroom was rocked by the revelation that not only had the man in the photograph set the fire, but he had also been involved in a much larger scheme. The air in the room seemed to crackle with the weight of the discovery, and the floor beneath Peter's feet felt less solid than it ever had. It wasn't just the fire anymore. It was the entire structure of the case, the network of people who had worked in the shadows to make Peter the scapegoat for a crime he hadn't committed. His story, it seemed, was just one thread in a web of corruption that spanned much farther than anyone could have imagined. Peter's breath caught in his chest as the details poured in, each one a heavier burden than the last. The man in the photograph, the one whose image had set the course for Peter's redemption, had not acted alone. It was as if a massive boulder had shifted, revealing a dark, hidden landscape. Behind the flames of the fire, behind the lies and false accusations, was a far-reaching conspiracy that had manipulated the justice system itself. The prosecutor, Holt, was still reeling from the discovery, his face drained of color as the truth unfurled like a nightmare. The realization was dawning on everyone in the room: this wasn't just about one arson. This wasn't just about one wrongfully convicted man. This was about a system that had been twisted and corrupted by those in power, a system that had used the law as a weapon, not as a shield. The connections began to pile up, one after the other, each discovery more damning than the last. It turned out that Peter's case was not unique, it was one of many, each manipulated by the same shadowy network of people who had used the justice system for their own personal gain. The fire that had consumed everything Peter had worked for had been set with a purpose: to distract, to cover up, and to silence the truth. And in the center of it all, orchestrating the whole affair, was the man who had framed Peter for the crime, the man who had set the fire and, unbeknownst to Peter at the time, had once been Max's owner. The shock of it all hit Peter with the force of a tidal wave. How could it have gone so deep? How could they have lived in a world so broken that something like this could happen? Every system he had trusted, every safeguard he had believed in, had failed him. The people he had thought were fighting for justice were instead fighting for power and control. Peter had been nothing more than collateral damage, a pawn in a game far beyond his comprehension. But amidst the darkness, something bright and unwavering had stood: Max. As the enormity of the conspiracy became clear, Max's role in the investigation became more and more evident. The dog, who had once been abandoned by the man who set the fire, had been the silent witness to everything. Max had never been just a companion, he had been the key all along. The more Peter thought about it, the more it made sense. Max had been in the right place at the right time, his instincts sharper than anyone had realized. It wasn't just a matter of loyalty or affection, it was fate. Max had been there, quietly observing, watching, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. He had sensed the corruption long before Peter had, and when the time came, Max had barked in Peter's mind, guiding him to the photograph that would start the chain reaction that would unravel the entire network. Max had been Peter's constant, his guardian angel in the most literal sense. When Peter had been too broken to see the truth, Max had seen it all. The dog had known the pieces that were missing, the lies that had been told, and the faces of the people who had profited from Peter's pain. He had been there when the fire was set. He had been there when Peter was convicted. And, most importantly, he had been there when the truth finally began to rise to the surface. Max had not just rescued Peter from despair. He had saved him from a lifetime of wrongful conviction, a lifetime of living in the shadow of a crime he didn't commit. It was Max who had fought for him in a way that no one else could. While Peter had been lost in his struggle for survival, Max had been quietly working behind the scenes, pushing him toward the light. The dog had never given up on him. Even when the entire world had turned its back, Max had never wavered. Peter's thoughts turned inward, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to reflect on everything Max had done for him. Max had not only been his companion through the hardest moments of his life, he had been the one true friend he could rely on. The dog had given him the strength to keep going when it seemed impossible. Every morning, when Peter opened his eyes and saw Max's familiar face, it had been a reminder that he wasn't alone. Max had been more than just a pet, he had been a living, breathing embodiment of hope. And now, Max's silent loyalty had proven to be the one thing that had held the key to Peter's freedom. As the courtroom continued to buzz with confusion and disbelief, Peter felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over him. He had been wronged, he had been betrayed by the very system that was meant to protect him. But in the end, the truth had come out, and it was Max who had led the way. Peter turned his gaze to the judge, her face still pale, her hands trembling as she reviewed the new evidence that had been uncovered. The weight of the moment was suffocating, but there was a flicker of hope in Peter's heart. Finally, after all these years, the truth was coming to light. And no one, not the corrupt individuals who had woven the web of lies, not the prosecutor who had been complicit, could stop it now. The tide had turned, and it was Max, the silent witness, who had made it all possible. With the truth finally exposed, Peter was released from prison. The heavy clang of the cell door, once a daily reminder of the confinement he had been forced to endure, now rang with a new sense of finality. For the first time in years, Peter could breathe without the oppressive weight of the bars around him, the cold, unyielding walls that had closed in on him for so long. As the door swung open, a flood of light spilled into the small, dimly lit cell. It was a stark contrast to the gray, sterile interior he had come to know as his world for over a decade. His body, stiff from the years of isolation, took a moment to adjust to the sudden freedom. But his mind, once clouded by hopelessness, felt clearer than it had in years. Peter stepped into the light, and the weight of the outside world, the world that had seemed so far beyond his reach, finally hit him. The air was warmer than he remembered, the sounds of the world outside were louder, more vivid, and the faces of those waiting for him were a blur of emotion. The world had moved on without him, but here he was, stepping back into it, ready to rebuild what had been torn away. And there, standing at the entrance of the prison, waiting as if he had never left Peter's side, was Max, his loyal companion, his protector, the one who had fought for him when no one else would. Max's golden fur shimmered in the sunlight, his eyes bright with recognition, his tail wagging furiously as if he knew that this moment was the culmination of everything they had both been through. The sound of Max's excited bark rang out, a joyful note that cut through the tension of the moment. Peter's heart swelled, and in that instant, all the years of heartache, all the struggles, all the silent suffering he had endured, they all seemed to fade into the background. There was nothing in that moment but Max, and the overwhelming sense of love and relief that flooded Peter's chest. Peter knelt down, his legs shaky from the long years of confinement, but he was determined to reach Max. As he embraced the dog, tears streamed down his face. It wasn't just a release of emotion, it was the release of everything that had been bottled up for so long, the frustration, the anger, the helplessness, and most of all, the deep, aching gratitude for the dog that had been his constant companion through it all. "You saved me," Peter whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You never gave up on me." Max responded the only way he knew how, by licking Peter's face, his tongue gentle and warm against his skin. The dog's tail wagged furiously, thumping against the ground with each joyful beat. Max seemed to know, without question, that this moment was everything they had both been waiting for. "I've always been with you," his tail seemed to say, a silent promise of loyalty and love that had never wavered, even in the darkest moments. For Peter, that bond was everything. It was not just a connection between man and dog, it was the manifestation of years of unspoken understanding, a testament to the power of companionship in the face of adversity. The silence between them had been filled with more than words ever could be. Through every sleepless night, every moment of despair, it had been Max's presence that kept him tethered to the hope that, one day, the truth would emerge. Max had been the unshakable foundation on which Peter could build his strength. The years of silence and suffering had forged a bond that no amount of time could ever break. The truth, the thing Peter had yearned for, fought for, and been denied for so long, had finally come to light. And in the end, it was Max who had been the key to unlocking it. His instincts, his loyalty, his unwavering commitment to Peter had been the thread that led them to freedom. Max had not only been his protector, he had been his guide, his partner in the fight for justice. Max had carried the truth within him, a silent witness to the lies and manipulation that had caused Peter's downfall. And now, that truth had set him free. Max had always known. And now, Peter understood something he hadn't fully grasped before. The dog's loyalty had been more than just a reflection of love. It had been a force, a quiet power that had pushed Peter to never give up, even when the weight of the world seemed to be crushing him. Max had been there when Peter had no one else to turn to. And in return, Peter would never forget the depth of that loyalty. The bond they shared was not just a bond of companionship, it was a bond of survival, of shared struggle, of a truth that could not be denied. Max had been the silent hero, the one who never faltered, who never turned away, even when the world had abandoned Peter. And in the end, his loyalty had changed Peter's life forever. It was as though Max had been the heart of the story all along, his silent devotion the thread that held everything together. In a world filled with noise, with deceit, with the crushing weight of injustice, it had been Max's silence that had spoken the loudest. Max's truth had led them both to the freedom they had so desperately needed, and for that, Peter would be forever grateful. The world was waiting for Peter, but in that moment, he had everything he needed. Max, the dog who had always been by his side, was now the key to everything. Together, they had faced the impossible, and together, they would walk into the future, unbroken, unstoppable, and free. Don't let this incredible journey of truth and loyalty go untold. Hit the subscribe button to follow Peter and Max's story from injustice to freedom. Join the fight for justice, and discover how a dog's loyalty can change a life forever. Share this video to spread hope, and comment below with your thoughts. Let's keep the conversation going.